Snow sifted down from a pewter sky, the kind of slow, steady fall that muffled sound and made even the ugliest parts of the frontier look softened. Elias Crow trudged through it with the measured steps of a man used to carrying his own silence. His boots left dark prints on the slush-packed main street of Benson's Crossing, past shuttered windows and the thin curl of chimney smoke. He had come for lamp oil and salt, essentials for a winter in the mountains, and nothing more. The trading post door groaned when he pushed it open, releasing a pocket of warm, smoky air. Inside, the potbelly stove spat and clanged, its iron belly glowing red. A half-dozen men loitered near the counter, their low laughter turning sharper when Elias stepped in. He ignored them. He always did. His reputation as the hermit in the hills had been earned honestly. But this time there was a different note in their voices, a ripple of anticipation. Their attention wasn't on him at all, it was on the girl standing near the back wall. She was maybe 20, though hardship had shaved something off her youth. Her dress was a thin calico, torn at the hem, the faded blue of summer skies long gone. Her wrists were bound loosely with a frayed rope, as though more for show than restraint, but her posture, straight, chin tilted, said she knew this room could turn dangerous in a breath. Her eyes were clear, a pale gray that caught the light, and fixed not on the men, but on the floorboards at her feet. Jonah Rusk, the trader, stood beside her, a grin like an open wound stretching across his face. $2, he said, smacking a palm against the counter for emphasis. That's all it'll take. She's strong enough for housework, maybe kitchen help. Ain't worth more than feed for a mule, but you'll get your coin's worth if you ain't picky. The men chuckled. One offered a coin just to see her flinch. She didn't. Elias watched her fingers twitch at her sides, the faintest sign of life under all that stillness. Something cold and hard twisted in his chest. He didn't plan it. The words came low and flat, surprising even him. I'll take her. The room stilled. Jonah's eyes narrowed, then lit with triumph. $2, Crow. Cash on the counter. Elias untied his coin pouch, poured the silver out one piece at a time. It made a dull, final sound in the quiet. No one spoke as Jonah cut the rope from her wrists and shoved her forward. She stumbled, caught herself, and stood beside Elias without looking at him. He didn't offer his arm. Outside, the snow had thickened, drifting into the seams of his coat. He led her to where his mule waited, steam rising from its flanks. Without a word, she climbed up behind him. The mule shifted under their combined weight, and they set off north toward the pine-clad hills. For the first mile, neither spoke. The world was reduced to the steady plod of hooves and the hiss of falling snow. Her presence was a solid warmth at his back, though she held herself stiff, as if leaning against him might cost something she wasn't willing to pay. Elias didn't look back. He noticed, after a while, that her hands were bare. The skin was pale, the knuckles reddened with cold. He reached into his coat, pulled out his old leather gloves, and passed them back over his shoulder. She hesitated, then took them. Her fingers brushed his briefly, just a whisper of contact, and he felt the jolt of it long after. She didn't thank him, but he hadn't expected her to. The forest closed in around them, the scent of pine resin rich and sharp in the damp air. The trail narrowed, winding between drifts that rose like frozen waves. When they reached the cabin, dusk had settled, staining the snow in shades of violet and blue. It was a small place, built of rough-hewn logs, the smoke from its chimney twisting into the dark. Elias dismounted, then helped her down, more out of instinct than gallantry. She stood in the snow, holding her thin satchel like a shield, eyes sweeping over the cabin as though weighing the risk. Inside, the air was warm, the fire snapping in the hearth. The room was simple. One table, 2 chairs, a cot pushed close to the flames, and shelves lined with jars and tin cups. Elias hung his coat by the door, then turned to her. "It's warmer by the fire," he said, nodding toward the cot. She stepped in cautiously, every move measured. The door shut behind her with a solid thump, cutting off the howl of the wind. She placed her satchel at her feet and stood near the hearth, her gaze fixed on the flames. Elias busied himself with the woodpile, splitting a few more logs and stacking them by the wall. He didn't know what to say, never had been much good at talking. Bringing her here had been a decision made in a single heartbeat, one he didn't yet understand. Pity maybe. Or loneliness. Or something nameless that had stirred when he'd seen her standing in that smoky room, surrounded by laughter that wasn't laughter at all. She didn't speak either. Only when he moved past her to set a kettle on the hook over the fire did she glance up, her eyes flicking to his face and away again. Later, after a supper of cornbread and beans, most of which she barely touched, Elias spread a blanket over the cot for her. He took the chair by the table, pulling another quilt over his shoulders. The firelight threw their shadows large against the log walls, two shapes bound together by a shared space and little else. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. The sound filled the gaps where conversation might have been. Clara lay curled on the cot, her back to him, her breathing steady. Elias stared into the flames until his eyes blurred. He thought of the road that had brought him to this place, the years of isolation, the empty winters. And now this, another soul under his roof, a stranger with guarded eyes and unspoken history. When he finally slept, it was fitful, the kind of rest that leaves a man half listening to the night. Somewhere in the dark, fabric whispered. He opened his eyes enough to see her small form moving near the hearth, head bent over the quilt on his cot. Her fingers worked quick, precise stitches, mending the tear he'd ignored for months. She didn't know he was awake. He closed his eyes again, not wanting to startle her. In the morning, the smell of coffee roused him. She was sitting at the table, shoulders straight, hands wrapped around a tin cup. He poured himself one, then, without thinking, slid the small sugar tin toward her. She took a pinch, stirred it in, and didn't look at him. But when she raised the cup to her lips, her hands lingered on the warmth. Elias sipped his coffee, the silence between them no longer sharp-edged, but softer somehow. Outside, the snow kept falling, a slow, steady curtain over the world. Inside, something had shifted, too small to name, but enough to keep him from wondering why he'd brought her here. Now he only wondered what might come next. The days folded into each other, a seamless stretch of white and shadow. Winter in the high country did not relent. It pressed inward, closing the distance between the cabin's four walls and the two people inside. Elias and Clara worked side by side in the rhythm survival demanded, splitting wood, fetching water from the half-frozen creek, checking the snares that hung limp more often than full. The air between them was cautious, like ice over a deep stream, but each small act left faint marks, a slow etching of familiarity neither spoke of. Clara's skill with a rifle surprised him the first time he watched her sight along the barrel. She didn't boast, didn't meet his eyes after the clean shot dropped a hair into the snow, but he felt something shift, respect, unspoken, resting like an ember between them. In the evenings, she sometimes hummed low while mending seams or patching torn mittens, the sound threading through the quiet in a way that made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a place meant to be lived in. Once, while delivering a bundle of pelts to Mrs. Tully for trade, Elias heard the kind of talk he'd been expecting. Men in the store muttered about the girl he'd bought, the kind of smirking judgment that traveled faster than weather. He let the words pass without answer, but his jaw had tightened all the way home. Clara didn't need to hear it, though some part of him knew gossip found its way uphill just as easily as wind. She did hear, eventually. He came in one afternoon to find her at the table, hands still, eyes fixed on nothing. When she spoke, it was without looking at him. "They think you paid for me like they'd buy a mule." Elias set down the sack of supplies. "Let them think what they want." Her gaze finally met his. "And you? What do you think?" He took a moment before answering. "I think folks talk about what they don't understand." It wasn't the full truth, but it was all he could shape into words. She looked away first, but there was no heat in it, only a quiet he couldn't read. By mid-February, the weather turned vicious. Snow came in hard from the north, the wind driving it sideways, so that stepping outside felt like being flung into a river of ice. They kept to the cabin, firewood stacked high by the door, stew simmering in the pot. On the second day of the blizzard, with the light dim even at noon, Clara asked him the question he'd known was coming. "Why did you take me from that place?" He was whittling by the fire, the small shavings falling at his boot. The knife stilled in his hand. "Because no one should stand in a room full of men and be treated like something less than human." The words hung in the air, and for a long time she said nothing. Then, almost too softly to catch, "No one ever said that to me before." He looked at her then, and she didn't look away. Something passed between them, not a promise, not yet, but the quiet recognition of one soul to another. On the third night, the storm's voice rose to a howl that shook the shutters. Some time after midnight, a sound cut through it, a sharp, frantic noise from outside. Elias was on his feet before he knew why, pulling on his coat. Clara followed, already reaching for the rifle. The mule pen stood half buried in snow, but the shapes moving at its edge were unmistakable, wolves, lean and desperate. One darted in toward the gate, teeth bared. Clara lifted the rifle, breath steady, but the snow came thick, blinding. A dark blur lunged from the white, too close, and she stumbled back. Elias was there in an instant, shoving her aside as the wolf sprang. The shot cracked, echoing in the storm, and the animal crumpled into the drift. The others scattered, shadows swallowed by the night. He caught her arm, hauling her upright. Her cheeks were raw with cold, eyes wide but unshaken. "You came for me," she said, voice muffled by the wind. "Always," he answered, and it was the simplest truth he'd ever spoken. They fought their way back inside, snow melting into the floorboards, firelight catching in the wet sheen of their coat. She stripped off her gloves, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from the sudden return of warmth. He busied himself banking the fire higher, though his own heartbeat was still hammering from the image of her in the wolf's path. The next morning, the wind had eased, but the world outside was locked under a crust of ice. They worked in companionable silence, thawing the water barrel, mending the mule pen. By midday, sun broke through the clouds, glinting off the snow so bright it hurt the eyes. Clara stood in the doorway for a long time, looking at the sweep of white that stretched toward the horizon. When she turned, something in her expression had eased. She began planting seeds in a small box near the window, a handful of beans, a row of lettuce, using soil she'd found in a sack tucked behind the woodpile. Elias watched from the table, saying nothing. It struck him that this was the first thing she'd done not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Days lengthened, and the snow began to pull back from the earth in slow, wet patches. Elias noticed she spoke more, little things about the weather, the way the creek sounded when the ice cracked. Once she laughed, quick, almost startled at herself, when the mule nudged her pocket for an apple she didn't have. When they went into town again, Mrs. Tully's eyes softened at the sight of Clara walking beside him, her shoulders straighter than before. Gossip still trailed behind them, but Clara didn't flinch this time. If she heard the whispers, she let them slide off like meltwater. That night, back in the cabin, she poured the coffee and slid the sugar tin toward him. "You never told me your middle name," she said. He looked up, caught by the smallness of the question, the way it rested easily between them. "Don't have one," he said. She smiled faintly, the fire painting her face in amber light. "Then I'll just have to make one up." Outside, the air was sharp with the scent of thawing earth. Inside, the space between them had narrowed to something that felt less like distance and more like choice. Elias leaned back, studying her in the firelight, and thought, not for the first time, that the cabin had grown warmer since she'd come, though the fire burned no higher than it used to. The last of the winter would pass. There would be planting to do, fences to mend, 100 chores that would wear the days down to their bones. But for now, in the quiet, there was only the steady burn of the hearth, the sound of her breath across the table, and the knowledge that neither of them was alone in the hills any more. It was not love in the way folks in town might imagine it, no grand declarations, no ribbons or rings, but it was something harder to name and harder to lose. It had been built in silences, in the passing of gloves on a cold trail, in the mending of quilts, in standing shoulder to shoulder against wolves in the snow. And as the night deepened, Elias found himself hoping, in a way he hadn't dared in years, that spring would be long in coming, just to keep her here a little while more.